This is the Gomaluku podcast.
And we are good. Leilani, thank you so much. Thank you so much for getting on the show, getting on the podcast. Really means a lot to me.
Say no more
Actually,
for having me.
actually, didn't we during the during the happy birthday, not happy birthday, the happy birthday marathon on Indigenous knowledge, didn't we talk about something that we should talk for a lot longer than the 10 minutes in which I, like, the first 5 minutes I pretty much pushed you to start your own podcast? Did we wasn't this already in the works, or in the stores, in a way?
In a way.
In a way, yeah. So thank you so much for getting on the podcast to so for people, like, it's always like to get through the first 5 or 10 minutes, which for a lot of podcast interview like hosts is difficult, but which is for me actually the most fun part, because I get to ask 1 or 2 questions actually, and which gets to the people to describe themselves in a way. So Leilani, if you could just still and I love comics, so I'm just gonna make a comic reference, or your origin story as the Leilani origin story, so that people can put you and your amazing stories that you're about to share into the right context.
That is always a really hard thing to answer.
Especially on cue, right? Especially on cue.
There's one of the Miss Alohas from the Merry Monarch March used to say that, like, Kanaka Maoli women were just vessels for all of our ancestors that came before us. So I'd like to start a couple generations back.
Perfect.
My grandmother is Brahida Pangelinin Cruz-Martinez, and she was the first person in that part of the family to ever leave Guåhan for good. Guåhan is Guam, the indigenous name for Guam, which is a what's called an unincorporated territory of the U.S., and is one of the 17 recognized colonies. They're called non-self-governing territories by the UN, but they're colonies. She and that entire side of my family are from the Jeje and Romeo clans of Guam. And she, when she was eventually pushed out of Guam for historical reasons that we'll get to,
Sure.
she met my grandfather, who was the product of a long group of black-birded pineapple plantation laborers and Native Hawaiian women. My grandfather was a laborer on the Del Monte plantation, the Kania Camp plantation in Hawai'i, and he met my grandmother in the continental U.S., and we, for a lot of reasons, no longer had a home in our homelands, and now I am living on Turtle Island, trying to get back.
So all right. So one thing that always intrigues me is people's who they were when they grew up, who they were, their childhood. Who were you in retrospect? Who were you? How was your childhood like?
So, um, I, I grew up for my early childhood with my mother, who was a strong Pacific single mother. She was also in grad school when I was little and interning at the Mayo Clinic. She's an incredible scientific biological researcher. So my early childhood was a lot of my grandparents, who I've just mentioned, a lot of their support and love and care, in addition to, being dragged around into college classes with my mom. I think hearing her give TA lectures is one of my earliest memories. And that totally shaped who I am, because she had a heavy focus on how pollution was affecting the development of frogs. That was her big PhD. And growing up with her concern for what we were doing to the earth, and particularly the fact that she gave the same concern to animals as to people, coupled with my grandparents getting to share a very rich and particularly rich mixed Pacifica heritage with me, even though we were away from home.
Right.
Yeah.
Did your mom's how should I say it, expertise and passion for environment, did that also influence or trigger your interest in protecting the environment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I wanted to be just like her. I thought she was the coolest person ever. I still think that she's very cool. Um, she also is one of the people who showed me that a care and concern for the environment was tied to Pacifica culture. She has a creation story, the oceanic beginnings of the Kumulipo, the Hawaiian creation chant, interpreted on her back in tatau and tattoo. And that's really part of her research. And I thought I wanted to be a scientist like her. And this is something we talked about during your birthday marathon. When I got into academia, I felt very alienated as an Indigenous person practicing science. And I just figured that I am better suited to being a storyteller and figuring out how to help people with that.
Right. What was the experience actually that made you in that academic part of your life, the experience that made you say like, this is not for me?
Oh, it's so hard to bring it down to just one. I will talk about this is probably what broke me in academia. Here across Turtle Island, there's a huge issue, a genocide of Indigenous women, the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic. And my first year in college, I experienced severe sexual, emotional, and physical violence. And here in the US, you're supposed to go through your university when that happens on a college campus. And I was stuck in a drawn out process by the university for 3 years. And when the university ignored it, I went to the police, and the police also ignored it. And it was having to experience having the knowledge that I was in essence a genocide survivor, because I had gotten away from a violent white American man who attacked me as an Indigenous woman. When I realized that despite the work I was doing, the institution, my academic institution, wasn't supportive of me, I just this is a story I tell a lot, but I just sought out other Pacific Islanders. I sought out my grandmother first, and one, realized how common of an experience this is among other Indigenous women and Two-Spirits and other gender minorities. And I had people who I could talk to about this. But I also, the way I put it is, when this extreme act of violence occurred, it sort of felt like my narrative, I'm going to say narrative because I'm a storyteller, my narrative had been cut short. And I figured that if I couldn't see a future, I'd keep looking into the past. And so I started going to all of the Manamko and Kapuna that I could find, all of the elders, and just sort of asking for stories and being able to hold a space that would be receptive and empathetic and open, gave me a lot of it made my story seem like it wasn't over. The Pacific is a place that has gone through so much, and yet we're all still here. And yeah, it was just, after that, I changed everything and just wanted to spend all of my time fighting with people who are also fighting for, so there's this word Itanotazi, the ocean lands, because it's our sea of islands.
What's just for context, so people know that Leilani, I met you at in Madrid, in the belly of the beast, so to say.
Yes.
That was at COP25, and what two things that went through my mind. One, amazingly strong person, Indigenous person from Guåhan, and that was one thought that went through my mind. And the other thought was, shoot, I did not get to talk as much as I wanted to with Leilani, because you were doing a lot of things actually at the venue. We only, I don't know, there was some points that we crossed paths probably, and I was at the office when you came in and I went out, and then all right, obviously the incident at the COP, when the security did some crazy things to break up an action in inside the venue. But yeah, after that we didn't talk too much. So Yeah, it was, and that and what I recalled, and from the brief conversations, and also from having listened to you, or people talking about you, good,
Oh no.
in a good way, in a good way. Don't get me wrong, in a good way. Is you have a fascination for stories.
Yeah.
Um, and I love stories as well. But if 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 I had, my palette of stories is not as sophisticated as yours. When I listen to like when I watch video, yeah, your presentations, videos, read your stuff. I'm like, yeah, that's whole new whole another level. And which brings me also to a yeah, it's like ulterior motive for you getting you on a podcast as well, is yeah, to pick your brain about, all right, what makes it yeah, how do you develop your storytelling, which, because it is hard for a lot of people, and they have a story but they don't know how to tell it, including myself, 100%. um that's why I'm talking to people on a podcast. I'm not telling my own story on a podcast. Um, so yeah, I don't know how to circle this to a question, or but it is. I just want to like recognize your amazing gift for storytelling, and maybe that's a good way to start. This whole conversation is what I always admire from people that are good at storytelling, that they also, when I ask them about their dreams or a vision for their community, for their peoples, it just takes you away into a, yeah, it triggers your imagination. um Not to put any pressure on you, but as an activist, as a rights defender, as a uh, yeah, an indigenous person, um, have you ever thought about, or like, what's your vision or what's your dream personally, as well as for Guåhan?
Um. Ooh. Well,
We have time. We got the
so
time.
I think I want to start by talking about stories.
Mm.
Um. Before I get to dreams. Um. So, talanoa is a word that we used when we set up that my favorite event at COP25, which was that wonderful, um, wonderful circle of storytelling and singing, led by Pacifica Youth on the Pacific Pavilion.
Yeah.
Um, I I really value the role in activism that just being able to hold very sacred and intimate spaces. It is an act of defiance because we were amid all of these stuffy people in their suits who were like talking about putting in motions and using parliamentary procedure that I barely understand.
Yeah,
um,
brackets and commas.
yeah,
Yeah.
and amid all of that, we all had our shoes off and we were on like palm mats, and
Mhm.
that is beautiful because they don't have space for us there, and we made it anyway.
Yeah.
Um, if
Explain to people what Talanoa is.
Talanoa, the way that I've always understood it,
Mm.
is to mean um, getting together a group of people and sharing your stories in a way that specifically works to bind you together with each other. that is what talanoa is for me and what I try to achieve.
Yeah.
I think that is it's also a practice that I fell in love with in Portland, Oregon. There is this group of queer and trans Pacific Islanders. They call themselves cutie pies, QTPIs. In the diaspora here on Turtle Island, called Utopia, the United Territories of Pacific Islands Alliance.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice one.
I know. So I was part of Utopia in Portland, and we would host these monthly talanoas where we would have the Islanders, whether it was, the couple of actual island restaurants, or people barbecuing in the backyard. We'd get together over food and just talk story aimlessly about a given topic. And I really fell in love with the practice, and also realized its power there. And we were among so many incredible activists in Madrid, and everybody had a different purpose. And I think when I was early on in community organizing, I really struggled to figure out what my purpose is. I'm really not as brave as many of our other activist friends. And I don't have the, just the cunning sometimes to even be able to strategize, but I know what I can bring is an ear and a few memories.
Which is also a very important part of activism,
Yeah.
if you ask me, because it comes in various shapes and sizes and forms. A lot of people think that activism is standing on the barricades with a banner, but there's so many more elements to it, layers to it, that in a way that activism, and I'm trying to find the right word for it actually, because I don't think activism covers it anymore.
Yeah.
That it is not there's not one definition to stand up for something that is bigger and fight for something that is bigger than you, and that can contribute to the well-being of everyone else, for everyone. And there's so many more layers to it. So it is what you're doing isn't, I would say, like, is an essential part, because it is the ability to communicate and transmit knowledge and through stories to other people. There's yeah, like, you want to, like, activism is winning. In a way, it is winning hearts and minds, and you can do it through whole different ways, because there are so many people, and they consume information or like knowledge in different ways. One needs to have hard facts, and other people, they need stories. So and that's why I absolutely loved the talanoa at the Moana Pavilion. So yeah, for people, just to give you a little bit of, to imagine, like, there's this Madrid, there's this huge hall, actually, that's the climate summit is at that point like the most politicized square kilometers in the world, where all these people come together and they all talk about climate, and it is hard to be known or like have your voice heard, whereas there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of people talking, and what I loved from, at least from the Pacific side, is that all these Pacific islands and nations, they created their own pavilion and they had their own side events, and it was, yeah, like they had events, they had kava at the end, and
Oh, that
that
was
was
people were always singing when everybody else was going
I
home.
loved it.
Pavilion was, it was like it was just opening up.
I loved it, and it was every time that I like, because what people should know is that it was a huge venue, and our office was on one side, and meetings were on the other side, and at least for me, like I had to walk all the way back and forth, and then I just always made it point or came up with an excuse. Just like, all right, yeah, I have to go to the I have to pass the Moana Pavilion to talk to someone from some country, and 9 out of the 10 times either they were singing or they were having fun, or and then that's what I love about Pacific. It is the sense of community that that we are able to bring to these very diplomatic, this very yeah, how should I say it, ivory tower like conversations that are happening. And Leilani, you talked about Talanoa, and for me, Talanoa is one of the ways to bring one thing back that is missing from these climate conversations, which is stories, which is bringing the human element back into these conversations, because that's what's missing. We're talking about human impacts, but we're not bringing in the human element. It's all about numbers and percentages and statistics and yeah, provisions and everything else. But we're not talking about stories. I really absolutely loved. I think it was considered not as part of the youth anymore, so I would just have to like stand it back and watch. But hey, I was cool with that. I was cool with listening to you guys, to everyone, just talk stories, sharing messages, and that's what people. Did you know? Did you know that the UN actually did a Talanoa a couple of years before that?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, it was. To me, it was disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think they have to be. The point is like binding together through storytelling, and Indigenous Pacific Islanders painting in broad strokes, but we tend to be a very intentions-driven group of people. If the intention to bind together isn't there in the storytelling, then the Talanoa, I just feel, can't be successful.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
So yeah, so people know, those of you watching and listening, what the Talanoa was, at least how the UN thought it should be, and this is where the entire where it goes off the rails. So 2000, I don't know, COP23, that was 2018. Fiji was the presidency of the Conference of Parties, because it rotates through regions, and that year was Fiji's turn, and they were organizing a facilitative dialogue. That was how they called it. Oh, no, that's what it was, but they called it a Talanoa. What I've been told, and I'm the first one to admit it, I'm not an expert on Talanoa. I just love the conversation, the ceremony, the practice. From what I've learned from one of my sisters from Fiji, is that it doesn't have an agenda.
Yeah.
It has a flow, but it does not have an agenda. And this Talanoa was, and it is all for optics, and that's what I hate about it. It was all optics. It was all right. You have people sitting in a circle, so it looks Fiji indigenous. It looks indigenous, but like you have people passing a mic, but there's an agenda. It's like, all right, first you answer this question, then you answer that question, and then you answer that question, and you only have 3 minutes. That's not a talanoa.
Yeah.
That's a debate. It's
Yeah.
not a talanoa.
If there's no singing and, there are no cousins wrapping up a plate to go in the background, it might not be a real talanoa.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It is. Yeah. It is. You need to have that. What I call like a homely feeling. Of being able to walk in, walk out, just feeling very at home, and not and for me, yes, when it comes to these conversations like talanoa, like I'll be the one listening and probably standing by the food bowl or whatever food that's on the table, just munching away whilst listening. That would be me. And that's the way that I consume knowledge. People are listening, they're like rolling their eyes at this point. They're like, he did not make that dad joke. Yeah, so it is. Yeah, so yeah, talanoa.
But I think what you've just mentioned, though, is one of the reasons that I think other people like me, should be the ones who are taking back storytelling. Because that wasn't talanoa doesn't mean it wasn't these bureaucratic and colonial forces crafting a story. One of the biggest issues with one of the most heartbreaking results of colonialism in where I'm from, Guåhan in Hawai'i, I think is the loss of storytellers. And in Guåhan particularly, the loss of storytellers and stories, which occurred forcibly, largely wiped out women completely from CHamoru history. And it's mistakenly said that CHamorus were matriarchal before colonization, but definitely matrilineal, and definitely an emphasis on respect of women was widespread throughout CHamoru history. Yet it's very difficult to find records of CHamoru women.
Really?
Yeah. And there's this also at COP. I loved seeing how many signs had Apeli Hau'ofa quotes on them. But my favorite Apeli Hau'ofa quote talks about how because most of our pasts in the Pacific have fallen out of the purview of, colonial mainline histories, our task is to give our next generations more memories and stories of the past than we ourselves were given. I'm paraphrasing, but
yeah,
that's something that really drives me is I want my sister, and I want the next 7 generations to have some memory of CHamoru women, some memory of CHamoru resistance, some memory of like the incredible sugar strikes in Hawaii that took place. Just some memories of resistance outside of nods to our histories.
And what memory or story is one that you, in your mind, one of the most significant or the most profound that you believe that should be definitely be why these stories and memories need to be preserved. I'm not asking to pick one, but just to give people an idea of the history and the stories of the CHamoru women.
So that's so hard. So my primary CHamoru culture and history teacher is this man named, sorry, I'm gonna cough really quick. Excuse me. My primary CHamoru history and culture teacher is this Wafanagwe, this teacher who is named Michael Lujan Bivakwa. And he likes to start everything with the story of, I guess you could call her perhaps the first CHamoru woman, which is Fu'una. And so I'm going to tell you a little creation story now.
Please.
Which is special because we did just have the CHamoru holiday Tumaguini, which is, I think it directly translates to "This is the way," but it is the start of the CHamoru lunar calendar. So the way I was told it, and there are a lot of different versions, but in the very beginning of the universe, so far in the beginning that there is no time, and there were two siblings who were born without parents, Puntan and Fu'una. And Puntan felt that he was dying, and before he died, he gave his sister Fu'una instructions on how to use his body to create the earth. And his chest became the sky, and his back became the earth, and his eyebrows became rainbows. One eye became the sun. One eye became the moon. And there are a lot of different accounts. Maget likes to remind all of his students about this one version, this archived version from the 16 or 1700s, where it says that his farts became thunder. So they really parceled out every part. But she takes his body with his death and creates the world, and she's still mourning. She cries the oceans into being and uses his blood to fill them. And realizing that her creation still wasn't complete, she turned herself into a rock that you can still see in Guam. It's called La Sofua. And years and years of rain eroded the rock until it became human flesh, and that peopled the world. That for me is so many. That story has so many parts of CHamoru culture that I find valuable in getting through the day, basically. There's this CHamoru word called mahaling that means longing and nostalgia, missing someone and melancholy, but kind of like a sweet melancholy, the kind of sadness that you feel when you learn about your history, a homesickness that you feel for a place that maybe you're not sure even exists. It's this idea of love and loss and mourning coming together, that the love between these siblings, and siblings are also seen as one of the most sacred relationships. My relationship with my sister, as we've talked about, is like the whole reason I do anything. Love and loss, as well as the sacredness of siblings, as well as, I read it as meaning that because CHamoru people are born of, the literal rock of Guam, because Guam is our first ancestor, we're the people who are supposed to take care of it. Yeah.
What I definitely loved about you sharing the story is the way that you tell it. You're not telling it, actually. It is, like here's where my insufficient palette of storytelling comes very obvious. You tell it in a way that I can imagine it, like how when you tell that story. And also it is and here's where I definitely relate also with how you tell it, is that you have a very profound love for Guåhan, and for everything that has something to everything that to do with it, including the stories of the creation story, is that you're not in Guåhan. You're in DC at the moment, which makes it, for a lot of people, it is hard to maintain their indigeneity on their lands, on their islands, let alone outside of it.
And I will say, so there is a huge difference in the way diaspora, Chamorros and islanders in general, and also even as we're saying this, blood quantum is like the primary measure of indigeneity in so many spaces in the US, even as we're speaking now. Where I feel very comfortable. I'm mixed Pacifica. I'm Chamoru and Kanaka Maoli, and I have trouble knowing how to express them both at the same time, because I think that indigeneity is very policed in the US, and it's policed everywhere, frankly. And in the US, I've just noticed indigeneity seems to be something that both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people alike seem to feel free to comment on how well they think other people are performing their own indigeneity.
Yeah.
So I do always feel self-conscious that I'm not representing my islands and my ocean in the right way. In DC, I feel like I need to be in DC right now because Guåhan is going through a long and gross political fight for sovereignty right now. And unfortunately, DC, 8,000 miles away from Guam, is where Guam is governed.
Yeah.
I cry not being in Guam, even though it's a place that I haven't lived. And I also have noticed there's a shift in generations. The way that my mom put it is that in her generation, generalizing, but diaspora CHamoru's tended to see themselves as better than Guam CHamoru's because they were more American and more, it's internalized colonialism.
Sure.
But there is a revival, a renaissance, really, of CHamoru culture in my generation right now. And I will say, I think it's because our grandparents, my generation's grandparents who went through severe trauma in World War II, finally feel safe enough to speak to us about what happened. There is a lot more embrace of CHamoru culture that I've noticed in my generation. And I've also noticed that diaspora CHamoru's and Pacific Islanders my age tend to be, I tend to encounter more pro-sovereignty, pro-independence CHamoru's in the US than really you would expect. In the island, it's still quite a contentious debate, but most of the islanders I've met in the continental US are pro-independence, I think, because the previous generations perhaps came to the US believing that they would get a better life, and there's so much discrimination for us here that we've faced. Plus, so many of the islanders, particularly Micronesians, Marshallese, Palauans in the US right now, are here, unfortunately, as a result of genocidal climate change and US nuclear testing. I wanted to talk in March because it's Mes CHamoru. It's CHamoru Culture Month, but March 1st today is also Marshallese Day of Remembrance for the nuclear testing that was done on people there. And so there are a lot more islanders here. There are a lot more islanders here who have, I think, access to more stories. More difficult stories, too.
Yeah. It is. First, like when you start sharing about your experiences was something. What came to mind is that both our situations are almost similar. I got into the movement as well because of my mom. My mom was like, unfortunately she passed away. But she was a saint to me. She started fighting for the movement of the Maluku indigenous native peoples when she was 17. We were independent, and but then like for example, West Papua, we were occupied, then quickly occupied by Indonesia, still occupied, and my mom was asked to help out with the movement. So at 17, she dropped everything that she wanted to go to school and everything else, but she dropped everything, and she went to the UN and started working for trying to help out for the movement. So I'm doing this because she started it. It started to rub off on me as in the love for doing something for your peoples, but not just your peoples, not from the Pacific region, but indigenous peoples in general. But what a lot of people what is a lot for hard to grasp for a lot of people is that my mom was not born on the islands. I'm not born on the islands.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I have very, at least for myself, I believe that I have a very strong sense of culture, strong very conscious of my indigeneity, my mom as well, and still by a lot of people, they felt the need to judge. Like despite what my mom did or what I did, what I do, people still feel the need to judge by saying, and here's something that we've been struggling with a lot, which led me to the conclusion that sometimes we are our own worst enemy. As sometimes it's not even Maluku natives or Pacific Indigenous peoples or Pacific Indigenous peoples. Just feeling the need to judge you by, well, you're not on the island, so like you're not indigenous. Like, who are you to judge? Who are you to judge somebody else's indigeneity or somebody else's story without knowing the full context? Like, and like, what does a real Pacific Islander look like then? Should we like do the haka 24/7 or like do the hula 24/7? Like what does a in your mind somebody that from Pacific look like? And people always have a certain image of their own image of what you should be, and no matter what I don't know, like this. I just want to check my thoughts with you. Like what are your thoughts on this? Is that like no matter what what you do, is that they will always judge you. So you might as well just do what you want to do, so that at the end you feel good about it and you keep fighting for what you think is right. And another element that is so similar to our situation or my situation is that on outside of the islands, it is we talk a lot about independence, we talk a lot about self-determination, whereas on the island it's not so much of a conversational topic. Mostly because it's oppression. Mostly is because we're so colonized still after 300 years by the Dutch and now 70 years by Indonesia, that we are afraid of to talk about something that was inherently ours, our right, inalienable right to our own being able to be our own country, our own nation, or be able to survive as a peoples, and which right now it is it has created this image or this view that the push for independence lives mostly outside of the islands than inside of it. And that's why, for example, Indonesia says, that's why we believe that the indigenous peoples of Maluku do not want to get independence, because it's mostly people that are living outside of it that wants it, and not the people inside of it.
Well, and that has been something that has been leveled at me specifically by this man named Dave Davis, who actually went to the Supreme Court suing Guam to stop our non-binding plebiscite on our political status. After my first time speaking at the UN, I gave testimony in favor of Guam's independence. He was on any article that mentioned me, saying she doesn't even live on the island. She has no say, like things like that. And that is, that's true. And I do my best. I have a community that includes people on island, and I do my best to make sure that I am in right intention with what the folks who are taking care of the actual soil are doing. But it's also totally divorced from the fact that, okay, I wasn't born in Guam. 4,000 years of my family has been, though.
Yeah. 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 Like, and yeah, he has no, because that's the very infamous, actually, that whole situation. That was in 2011, was it?
It actually only recently
suit?
was dismissed by the Supreme Court last May.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a piece about it in the Texas Observer. I went into the organizations that were funding his lawsuit, and they had ties to the DeVos family, which of course is Betsy DeVos, who was the Title IX or Department of Education secretary in the U.S. under Donald Trump, and Eric Prince's family, the owner of Blackwater.
And Blackwater is a private military company, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very, like, I should have put it, notorious.
He was just caught illegally selling arms to Libya too. Like he has previously tried to start his own air force. Like this is the forces behind Guåhan's colonial status. And of course that shouldn't really be surprising, since about a third of the island is military access only, and more than that is contaminated areas by military and Agent Orange poisoning. There are vets who have gotten Agent Orange poisoning just from being around it. And because of our colonial status, the people of Guåhan really have no say, no pathway to fight this. Yeah,
and was that because I'm sorry, I'm bringing up this it's called the Anti-Indigenous Handbook that you contributed to. So yeah, in 2011, a non-CHamoru white American living on Guam filed a suit, Davis versus Guam, accusing the governments of Guåhan of violating the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as his 5th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights, generous under the U.S. Constitution. In doing so, he halted the process of conducting a political status plebiscite, or a vote of all the members of an electorate on an important constitutional question that asked voters how they would prefer to fulfill the right to self-determination. Davis argued that the vote, which is only open to native inhabitants of Guåhan, is racially discriminatory.
It's really just a baffling case, and you know, what made it worse for me is that after he won, he wrote some really pretty racist things in one of the local Guam papers. Here, he said that that CHamoru's play the race card and whine about historical injustices while sucking up every available dime bestowed by a benevolent nation.
What?
Yes.
Like the CHamoru's would not be in that situation in the first place as the U.S. if the U.S. didn't colonize the territory of the Guåhans. Like, oh my god! Like, so, and he
won.
He won that whole.
Yes, the government of Guam has to pay him nearly $1 million in legal fees.
Yeah, this is why I don't get sometimes I don't get the I should yeah, I definitely should read the whole thing though, but like it's why I don't get it.
I get who I was talking about earlier. He calls the form of US colonization of Guåhan just like the dumbest form, because it doesn't really even make any sense what they do. There are so many redundancies. Like, we have a non-voting member of Congress, and they can kind of vote, but not if their vote would make a difference in whether or not the motion passed. And you can't vote for president, but they do vote. Their votes just aren't counted.
And this is what a lot of people don't know is that there are territories, quote unquote, considered by the federal government that are considered part of the so-called United States of America, but they don't like. But Guåhan is one of them. Puerto Rico is another one of them, I believe. And there should be some more as well. That
Samoa, U.S. Islands. Sorry, territory friends, please. I'm trying to think of the others.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about like others. Well, I don't want to get backlash and like when I publish the whole thing. Oh my god, you didn't mention me! Like, U.S.
Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico.
Yeah, but basically, you're part. You consider part of it, but you don't actually. You're not. You don't have any voting rights. You don't. You get the votes, but your vote doesn't count. So it doesn't make any sense.
The way that they put it legally is that the territories are, and this isn't going to make any sense, but it's a direct quote. The U.S. territories are foreign in a domestic sense. And the reason that the inhabitants can't vote is because this Supreme Court decision called the Insular Thesis determined that the people of the territories are, and this is another quote, alien races, and that they're incapable of understanding Anglo-Saxon values. And that is why the people of Guam can't vote. Yet they serve in the military at rates higher than average, much higher than average.
Really?
Yes. And die at rates. Pacific Islanders in general die at rates about 7 times the national average. And what's really, for me, breaks my heart, and I mean no disrespect to individual soldiers, My grandfather is a soldier. Many of my views come from talking with all of the indigenous people who, through economic draft, have had to serve the U.S. Army. The COFA territories, they're the Compact of Free Association territories that used to be in the Micronesian Trust area, Palau, FSM, and Marshall Islands. As penance for the U.S. testing nuclear weapons there, those islanders can live and work in the U.S. visa-free. They often do. We were talking before we started recording about how bad COVID is in the U.S. Most of the Pacific Islanders that come from those former nuclear test territories work in meatpacking plants in the U.S., where there have been some of the largest and most severe COVID outbreaks. And in many of these pork processing plants, particularly, there are long-standing allegations of abuse, like the factory managers holding on to the passports of these Pacific Island migrants when that is their only form of identification, and because they don't have a visa, only proof that they're allowed in the country. Those COFA inhabitants also serve in the U.S. military despite not being citizens. And yeah, in large numbers.
Yeah, good enough to pull a trigger, but not good enough to vote. It's beyond me how people can be treated as literally as not even second rank, but third or fourth rank citizens of a country. Well, we all know that the United States has not been very upfront with Indigenous peoples in the past, or being very good with Indigenous peoples in the past. But it is thank you so much for explaining that, because that is not what a lot of people know about territories like Guåhan, Samoa, and Puerto Rico, and everywhere else. It is so now, like my mind, and this is how my mind works, there's a lot of, we're talking about negativity, and which is important. You have to talk about the history. You have to talk about the injustices, because for far too long we have not been able to talk about it, or being able to publish it in a way. That's where my mind goes. But my mind also goes, all right, what to the, like, what Guåhan can be, what the Pacific can be, like the positive incarnation. You know what I mean? Is it the, like, what what a independent Guåhan would look like. That's always, I don't like, how do you want to proceed? Actually, you want to share some more about this, or you want to?
One more thing that I'll say on this that I think is a good transition is that I think that in a free and independent Guam and a free independent Pacific, all of our people really deserve space to collectively get through the traumas that the last 500 years have brought our people. I was talking about Utopia. One of the Talanoas that we had was on interracial relationships in the U.S. one of the things that was brought up was that some non-Pacific partners had a hard time dealing with the emotions of their Pacific partners. Because I do think that a lot of our cultures at least have a wider vocabulary for the things that you're feeling that allow you to feel them in a different way. But we're also a people that have gone through a trauma that is unrecognized by the rest of the world. My research in college, my thesis research, was on how the lack of recognition of the trauma in the Pacific has affected our own independence movements. And like another little anecdote that I'll tell is that there's this movie called The 81st Blow. And in it, a Holocaust survivor details 80 strikes that he's given in one of the concentration camps. And the 81st blow is that none of his peers believe him, that nobody listened to his story empathetically. And it's just a fact, especially recently, especially in World War II, there were massacres in concentration camps in the Pacific that, I mean, even the UN has yet to recognize. And I know that my grandmother, who's a survivor of the Menengen concentration camp in Guåhan, only recently felt comfortable speaking about it. There's been no, and this is another place that U.S. Colonialism, that our status as a colony has prevented us from even reckoning with the trauma of the last genocide. The terms of the Treaty of Paris that ended World War II disallowed the CHamoru people from seeking reparations from the concentration camp from Japan. So
really?
the only source of reparations that we can go to is the US. My grandmother put in an application detailing what she went through. Among these things that I did not learn until a year ago was that I lost a family member in the camps. She had filled out this form years ago. And when I talk about feeling like I need to be in DC, last January, there was a hearing where the US was finally, after 76 years now, reviewing these stories of the concentration camps in Guam. I was the only CHamoru in the room. As 8,000 miles away, members of the US Department of Justice adjudicated 99 cases of severe of war crimes. I was the only one in the room that wasn't an employee. I was the only one that was there to witness it. And in the end, they blanket awarded everybody who had died or was a relative of someone who died got $12,000 US. And anybody who just suffered war crimes but didn't die was awarded $10,000 US. And for comparison, the amount of money that the US Department of Defense spends recruiting for new soldiers in the Pacific is the equivalent of $16,000 per new Pacific soldier. So it is worth more to spend money finding soldiers in the Pacific than repaying people who survived atrocities.
Was it done through a FOIA act, like that the information?
No. Okay. So
Okay.
I have FOIA'd.
So for people that don't know, FOIA is Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I FOIA'd the Department of Justice. They gave me 5 records, including my grandmother's. And there are at least 3,000 of these records that they've adjudicated. They quoted me $14,000 US dollars in order to access them. And so this is, this is a really important part of CHamoru history.
Yeah.
Of American history, frankly, if the US is going to claim ownership of Guam.
Mm-hmm.
That, the descendants and even the living people who survived it are not allowed access to.
Oh my God. This is.
I know it's heavy. This is when I was telling you about mahjong earlier. This is kind of what I meant about that feeling of melancholy when you learn about your history.
Yeah.
It comes with a sense of homesickness.
It does. Because you sent me a video. Was it yesterday? This morning? Can't remember.
One of these days.
One of these days. One of these days. It was, and it was a ship from all the way from Spain. You describe it, because you the why March 1st is so important to talk about.
Well, one of the more unfortunate pieces of historical trivia about Guam is that it is the first place of recorded contact between Pacific Islanders and Europeans. So this March, Mes CHamoru, also commemorates exactly 500 years, 1521, since the CHamoru people found Magellan off the coast of Guam, lost and starving, and welcomed him onto the island. Then he burned my village down. Yeah. So in recognition of this 500-year anniversary, the monarchy of Spain has sent around the Juan Sebastian Elcano. It's a French, or not French, a Spanish naval ship named after the co-captain of Magellan's ship, because in an act of solidarity, Lapu-Lapu in what is now the Philippines killed Magellan. And Juan Sebastian Elcano completed the circumnavigation. So this Spanish ship named after Juan Sebastian Elcano it was Thursday night, but like early Friday morning in Guåhan, early Thursday night for me. The ship reached the western coast of Guam in commemoration of the landing, and members of so it was a very muted commemoration, of course, because of COVID. But members of the pro-independence coalition, Independent Guåhan, met it on traditional canoes. And the thing that I love about that video I sent you is that big giant ship that has like motors and stuff. That canoe is flying by it.
Yeah.
You know, that was one of the things that that Magellan and really all of the Europeans noted about Guam is we had the fastest boats around. When when Nate and I met, he asked me how far Papua was from Guam, and I was like, I think about 2 weeks by canoe. Like it was there are records of Spanish travelers who got lost who would have to ask CHamoru's for a ride to the Philippines because we knew how to get there. We had been traveling there already. So one of the names that Magellan gave us was Islas de los Ladrones.
Yeah.
Islands of Thieves. That is because CHamoru's did not have a sense of property in the same way and stripped the ship, put it in the common areas, all of the goods. There's debate about who shot first, but I'm gonna venture to say it was someone on Magellan. And then they burned down a bunch of villages. But one of the other names for Guåhan was Islas de las Velas Latinas, the islands of Latin sails. And that's because of the triangular sails on our traditional canoes. And if we're talking about boats, I have to tell one story about my great grandfather. So, my great grandfather, Manuel, everybody calls him like Tun Manuet Romeo. He was a fisherman, like, you know, a good Pacific Islander dad. He used to fish in Opera Harbor, which the U.S. Navy also admitted to leaking radioactive wastewater into. So great, my family was eating that fish. But he loved fishing. He spent all of his time fishing. And, you know, when we talk about also adaptation to colonialism, this is a story I think of, but he used to go to mass all the time, and my grandma says that she realized that whenever they were in mass, he clearly was thinking of something else. And so one day she asked him, you know, what do you think about when we go to mass? He said, oh, I'm thinking about fishing. And so she thinks for a second and she goes, so what do you think about when you're fishing? And he goes, oh, I think about God. And I, you know, when I was talking with some other folks about those boats, one of the things we were talking about was how bulky the Spanish ships, the galleons that used to pass through the Pacific are. They'd take so much longer to get through the Pacific, and they'd lose so many people. And it just, for me, illustrates where we are today. Those traditional canoes that met the Juan Sebastian Elcano, they were made by people who have to understand the ocean and the stars and the weather in order to get where they're going. And those other ships remove you. I don't even know how they float. You know, seafaring, of course, is like one of those things that defines the Pacific pre-colonization. And of course, it was something that the Spanish worked hard to erase. They burned our canoes when they got there. So it was an act of resistance for those canoes to be there 500 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the revival of seafaring is an example of Pacific cultural exchange. You know the story of the revival, right? With Papa Mau.
Yeah.
That wouldn't happen if it weren't for this cross-Pacific exchange. That if we look at the earliest expressions of the Pacific Islanders saw the oceans or the islands as connected. And of course, with the forced introduction of the Mela micro-poly divide has really forced a lot of intra-Pacific racism. Of course, with the breakdown of the Pacific Islands Forum right now, like that's something that is on my mind, but we have seafaring. And that's something, that's one of the reasons I have some issues with Moana. It just sort of papers over all of the exchange. I have a lot of problems with Moana, but that's one of the big ones. Papers over all of the exchange. But yeah, I think also it was a reminder for me. I'm trying to figure out, because nationalism is clearly tearing apart Turtle Island, where I am now. It's making it a very dangerous place here. I think that's part of fighting for sovereignty without falling into toxic nationalism. I think that's something that I need to make sure happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like I said, I'm gonna cover like 18 different things. Just stories.
There's so many things I want to touch upon. All right, let me start with. It's not an easy one, but it is the one that comes to mind is what I found what I'm very proud of is that for the Pacific, the Pacific is like for the rest of the world is how should it? Yeah, well, I don't want to sound like Cook or Magellan, but uncharted territory, as in a way of saying that a lot of people cannot comprehend that for us, like the ocean was like easy to navigate. It is like you just navigate through the stars, and it is your highway between islands, between our islands. And a lot of people like see water and ocean as an obstacle, and Pacific people saw it as a means, and that's what really I'm super proud of, is that is the seeing what other people don't see. And when for example, the hokulea, like I'm super proud of, even though I'm not Kanaka Maoli, but I'm super proud of that. It's like it's a showcase, it's a testimonial of our culture, of how relevant it is, and still how relevant it is still, actually, and how people still embrace it, and it's hokulea, and it's just an example of it, but there's so many examples all around the Pacific where that showcases how we navigate the big vast ocean. And something that crossed my mind like lots of years ago, I think like 10 or 20 years, no, not 20 years ago, but maybe 10 or 15 years ago, is I don't know if you've heard about this. There's this story of an ancient continent of Mu or Lemuria. Have you ever heard about it?
No, maybe. Tell me more.
So, I'm definitely not going to do any justice to it. But so there's people always talk about there was this lost continent of Atlantis, right? And it was just and people are still debating or talking about, well, yeah, was it in the Atlantic Ocean? Was it in some people are even saying that it's in Mediterranean Ocean? But in many Pacific cultures, and there's talk about a lost civilization, a continent, a lost continent. And there's a lot of books that talked about a sophisticated civilization that existed on the continent. So researchers in the early days, they thought that they were entertaining the idea of Mu or Lemu. In our language, we call it Mu, but I know in New Caledonia, Kanaki, they call it Lemuria. A lot of people, so researchers first assumed that it would be in the Indian Ocean, but then they quickly shifted based on the stories of Pacific indigenous peoples. They shifted their focus to our region, to the Pacific region. And there's some stories about how that continent submerged. Well, it didn't disappear; it just submerged. Obviously, there's this. You can go biblical on it. That like with the Noah's Ark, that the water rose and everything else. So it sunk. That the island didn't. That islands. That the continent sunk. Meaning, and this is just me, my thoughts going over it, that why, or it explains why there's a strong connection between all the indigenous peoples of the Pacific. We go to from Hawaii to Rapa Nui to our side to Guåhan to Aotearoa. That we all were part of a continent that was this vast, that was big, and we're living on the mountaintops of it because it sunk. Why the researchers started moving to their assumption that it was from Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean was that, for example, in our stories and in our chants, actually, are one of the oldest chants in our culture, which we now use as our national anthem. It has one chorus talks about the waves that we had to paddle away from our brothers and sisters, paddle away from the big water. This is a freely translated chorus. Freely translated into English. And it talks about Mu, M-U. In New Caledonia, or the Kanaki people, I asked them, and that's why I love actually also going to the UN. So I just asked them about stories, about like, all right, just checking my thoughts with them. And I told one of the representatives about Mu and Lemuria, and he said, it's strange because there's one word in the language in the Kanaki language that the Kanaki people were uncertain where it originated from. And he said, yeah, it was the word Lemuria. So I asked, all right, well, what does that word mean? So, and he said, and maybe this is just like tunnel vision. Like once you hear something, you just only record information that supports your assumption. And what he said was, what Lemuria means in their language was something that goes down and never went back up again.
Oh.
And there's there's something, and then I talked to Auntie Lilikala from Hawaii, and she studied the language, how the language has migrated, the language migration. So there's a lot of cognates between the different languages around the Pacific.
Yeah.
It is crazy it is crazy similar if you consider that it is like the Pacific is 1/3 of the planet. It is, and that one peoples in the north and all the way up in Hawaii, language is similar to Te Reo Maori, for example, and the Polynesian language. And well, there's a huge
There's
gap of water,
some words that are almost exactly the same in every single one of our islands.
Yeah. The funny thing is, if I talk in my own indigenous language, well, I should phrase it differently. I can, if people talk in Te Reo Maori, I can understand it because there's a lot of cognates. If people talk slowly, I would say slowly in Olelo Hawaii, I can understand like a little bit of it because there's a lot of cognates. For example, girl or woman in Te Reo Maori, for example, is wahine, right? And in Hawaiian, Olelo Hawaii as well. In our language, it is mahina. So there's, and when I count 1 to 5, is sane rua toru ha'arima, which is a lot very similar to Hawaii and Te Reo Maori. So it is super fascinating, actually. If you, just like, I don't know, like, it would be super fascinating if somebody started to rate a dictionary of, like, right, these are the words, and these are CHamoru words, and for 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 in Te Reo Maori, in Olelo Hawaii, in Alifuru language, my language, and Kanaki and everything else. I think at some point you can see like the migration of how a certain word developed. And there was one thing that Auntie Lilikala said, like, what, like, isn't it strange that a Latin American city has capital is named after one of the most used words in the Pacific, which is Lima or Rima. So there's, I don't know, there's a lot of influences throughout the world.
And there's evidence that Pacific Islanders had already made their way to what's now the Americas, even before European contact.
Before you did it, Magellan.
Yeah.
Cook and everybody else. Yeah.
You know, when you know how to use the ocean.
Hey, if you know how to use it, yeah, it is. And all these stories, they fascinate me because it reinforces the Pacific family of, it is, in essence, it's a family. There was one, when was it? there was I had a meeting once with at the UN with some states, and I'll say they're not on everybody's Christmas list. So I can't name any
Yeah.
names, but they're not on everybody's Christmas list. But I had the meeting. I had to have the meeting. But like once you get, because I started to share stories because I wanted to know where this person came from, what his needs were. So, and you can only get to that if you just start having like a normal human connection, like conversation. So that person came at some point. I don't know how that conversation developed, but when he corrected me on something, and which I found super fascinating, super interesting, was that like once you wanted to come up with some kind of a metaphor, you talk about like sleeping, then it's probably like sleeping dragon, right? Like so I wanted to emphasize like that the Pacific is a very strong region, and that they and it's almost like a sleeping dragon. And he corrected me like, no, it's not a dragon. Because the dragon is a one entity. The Pacific is a family. Like this coming from a state representative saying this, like having knowledge about the history of the Pacific, of the strength actually, because that's how I analyzed it, the strength of the Pacific, that is a sleeping family. And so I got a feeling. All right, I should not go too deep into this, but it triggered me. I was so fascinated about it. So like, it's like, yeah, all right, yeah, family, because he said, yeah, because it is a collective of family members, brothers and sisters, and that are so related to one another that that you can only see it as a family. Despite all their different, they're far away, like miles apart, they still have a strong connection to one another. So a dragon would not be the way to describe the Pacific. It is a family of that is asleep, because I made the sleeping reference.
Mm.
That was super interesting to me.
Yeah.
That
And
and yeah, goes to what you're saying about the relationship between all of us.
and I think that's another one of the really damaging one of the really damaging consequences of colonialism that we're trying to unravel right now.
Mm.
You know, by 1901, every single island in the Pacific was um, claimed by a colonizing power. And we were, you know, parceled up and split up. And for the last 500 years, you know, um, it's been part of the colonial project to erase that interconnectedness.
Yeah.
Even within the Marianas is actually a great example. The so Guåhan isn't the only part. You know who we were forgetting? Oh my gosh! Please, I'm so Dispensa Zoo. The other part of the Marianas Archipelago. I was saying Guåhan. Oh my goodness. The Northern Marianas Islands were forcibly politically separated despite being part of the same archipelago as Guåhan. They were forcibly politically separated, and some historians argue by accident of the US not knowing that they had only signed a treaty claiming Guam.
Mm.
It's a very complicated history. Yeah, but one of the other things that I should say um for my dreams of a free Guåhan are reunification of the Marianas. The Northern Marianas were politically separated from Guåhan by the US. And so, despite speaking the same language, being the same people, many of the families living in both parts, two different governments, different flags. Yeah, and particularly particularly during World War II, when Guam was claimed by the US and the rest of the archipelago was claimed by Germany and then Japan.
Hmm.
That's one of those aspects of colonialism that ripped apart a family. And that happened in the Marianas and across the Pacific. The Manavahine theoretical framework, where you're talking on the spiritual level, the familial level, tribal level, and like your own positioning as an Indigenous woman, Pacifica woman. There are all of these particularly damaging consequences of colonialism, not only these actual political consequences, but as we spoke about, like the spirituality, the loss of being able to practice culture, the loss of being able to identify as the full Marianas. Yeah. I am so embarrassed and ashamed that I forgot the Northern Marianas. I was thinking the whole thing. Oh.
Well, yeah.
It shouldn't even have to be spoken about separately. It should be one.
Well, if I don't think it matters at all. But like, I forgive you. But it is. Yeah, at least it's something that's something to say. There's something to say about, like, let's at least rejoice that you showed up at the party at all. Like that you came up with Northern Marianas at all. Because so yeah, don't sweat too much about it. It is because I also miss out a lot on a lot of I had to represent or speak on behalf of the Pacific several times, and that, like, even though doesn't matter how much I prepared for it, it could happen that I once or twice missed out on Wallace and Fortuna, for example.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, fuck, like it's not that people would would hang me for it, but it is, I totally get it from your standpoint, is that, yeah, but like, you want to be inclusive, you know the injustices, that to be able to to move forward, to be very inclusive, you have to also be very inclusive to in your words, and I 100% get it. And it's, yeah, is that the part of the decolonization process, you think, the for Guåhan, or what is, in your view, like it entails? Because there's a lot of views on decolonization. Some people only think of it as a mindset, whereas, like, decolonization has also a political function. Like, for example, in the situation in the territories of Guåhan and Northern Marianas, How do you look at decolonization? What is your view on it?
You know, there are so many levels to it. I mean, I feel sometimes almost like I get tunnel vision on the political aspect of decolonization, because I want a separate lectern for Guåhan at the UN. I want our own. Um, I I want a reunited Marianas lectern at the UN. I want the Pacific to I want all of the people of the Pacific from Guåhan to West Papua to be able to choose their destinies, to choose what's going to be best for you know what, I wanted to say the next 7 generations, but also to honor the past 7 generations. One of the things that really made me feel at home at COP25 was that when we were talking about mitigating factors, you know, these, what can we do to make places more livable after disasters, and how can we make them more livable for the people who have to stay, and the indigenous Pacific members kept bringing up, and how do we pay respects to our deceased relatives who are buried in these islands that are being swallowed by water. How I so much of what I want to make it like, if there's one thing that you remember about me and my future, my idea for a future free Pacific in general, it's one that's driven by our own understandings of our own past. And that's why I say I think I get really caught up in the political, the governmental aspect of what sovereignty for Guam and political reunification with the Marianas looks like. But, you know, I don't speak CHamoru fluently, and neither do most CHaMorus my age. And I want to. I want everybody to be able to. I want food sovereignty for the Pacific. I want us to, you know, we were self-sufficient. Guam was self-sufficient as an island feeding itself until World War II. I want us to be able to create forms of government that are responsive to. I started with the creation story for a reason. I want a free Pacific that honors the fact that the Pacific is our first ancestor.
Yeah. It is. I absolutely love that vision, because it builds on our history and builds on our own heritage. Actually, instead of, and here's where I believe where indigenous sovereignty or decolonization goes into what I always would call, I'm not a doctor, definitely, but what I always would call like Stockholm syndrome, as in when people talk about decolonization, independence, or sovereignty, they gravitate towards, obviously, like governance and yeah, for example, governance, and which is good, because you need this from self-determination includes self-governance, but people gravitate towards a form of government that is similar to the colonial government that has been occupying them for before they became independent. So, for example, Guåhan or West Papua, they would West Papua would gravitate towards a government similar to Indonesia. Whereas you're indigenous for no, you're indigenous. You've been there for since time immemorial, meaning that you had your own form of self government. You have your own form of autonomy or self governance or independence. You had your own form of a governing structure. It would be left field to or like to what is considered a government right today, but it would make sense. It would make sense to your peoples to dig deep, because to dig and resurface like what your governance structure was, and try to build on that. And I think with that you also include the your yeah, the stories, the of creation of Pacific kinship and everything else. I think it is my hope that I very much align myself with what you said, because and this is what a lot of people say, like the Pacific cannot be free if nobody is free. And I think like Vanuatu said it several times around the West Papua case, and I absolutely champion Vanuatu for always bringing up the West Papua struggle, mainly because of the reason they said what they said, like the Pacific cannot be strong and independent if nope, yeah, just the Pacific is not independent if yeah, West Papua is not independent, or anyone if within the Pacific is not independent. And yeah, I'd like to see that everyone being able to determine their own future, determine how they want to shape their lives, their communities, their everything. Like they should be able to have the right to do so. And I think that goes beyond decolonization being just a mindset, but it is so much more than that. It is I don't know. It goes more to self determination than decolonization. I think, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think also, I just want to even take that one step further. Not even just we in the Pacific aren't free until we all are free, but I would say that one of the biggest threats to Pacific sovereignty movements, Pacific environments, Pacific culture, Pacific survival is the incredibly toxic effects of militarism on this place that is a third of our home.
Yeah.
In the wake of the US invasion of Iraq, that was a surge of Pacific Islanders fighting other people. One of the really heartbreaking parts of colonialism for me, of militarized colonialism, the way that it has affected the people of the Pacific, is that it often pits colonized people against colonized people,
Mm-hmm.
because it is the Pacific Islander soldiers on the front lines. There were whole villages in Samoa that lost all of their young men. And there seems to be a particular arms race in the Pacific right now, with explosive base building from the US continuing and from China. And the two are in a land rush in these places that the world calls small. They really are seen. One of our colleagues, Nate, put it in one of his papers, that the Pacific isn't, the people of the Pacific aren't seen even as proletariats or as workers. Rather, the land is just a resource. And there's this land rush happening in the Pacific right now of these dueling global powers fighting for militarization. And until that's one of the ways that we can't be free in the Pacific until everybody is free.
Yeah.
As long as there is this forward posturing between nations, largely fought in places that don't have a say, by people who don't always have political power, this is going to be a fight for the Pacific.
Yeah, it is. What a lot of people don't know is that almost every colonial power in the world has been to the Pacific and has had a military presence, or still has a military presence.
Yeah.
Within the Pacific, and which is for a lot of people cannot comprehend how life is under. It is actually military occupation, because most of your land is occupied by military bases. So,
and not just a military occupation in so many places in the Pacific. Even when it's not active war, it is a simulated war zone. One of the biggest issues in Guåhan is that the island is used as a live fire practice site, even in areas where there are burials from the mass murders that we discussed earlier. The US military, during the pandemic, has begun construction on another live fire military training site on top of a 1,000-year-old burial. And they did it without, they excavated it without input before they got input from the community. They unearthed the remains of our ancestors without any CHamoru's present, and put them in paper bags that were put into the DoD offices. I read that they put a plaque in the parking lot of the firing center. In Hawaii, there is regular bombing as well. And of course, there's RIMPAC, which is the largest military games in the world that take place in Hawaii. And there, again, on occupied Kanaka Maoli lands, Indonesian troops practice tactics that they then use against West Papuans. That's what I mean by us becoming forcibly complicit in harm of other colonized people. There was this Micronesian priest, I think Willie Costa is his name. and he gave this sermon about about how the bombing that we're familiar with must sound to an Iraqi family. He gave it into this sermon in 2005, and he described it in vivid detail. And he said, and then imagine that you look up and it's the face of a young Pacific Islander boy. And that's the ultimate tragedy, I guess. Yeah, that's demilitarization is a big part of a free Pacific.
It is such an important part, and yes, it is in tandem with decolonization, demilitarization as well. For us to be able to live free, that the military presence is it is from conversations that I've heard. And here's all right. Here's I'm going to share something that has struck me as how should I say it? I was fairly disappointed about it. Was in negotiate within the UN, and Indigenous peoples had to were advocating or lobbying for and negotiating for a text. And one of the Pacific priorities was demilitarization of Indians' lands, and then it was not only demilitarization but also reparation, as in like you can leave, but you also like provide the means to for Indigenous peoples to repair the lands, because like at some point, like you just said, like in Hawaii, like you what did they so one image where they created a links, like to play golf on top of an ancestral burial grounds of Kanaka Maoli. Like so demilitarization is one, like get out of our lands, but also like reparation is also super important. And here's where what the conversation one conversation that followed was what that struck me as surprising and gave me also a little bit of a reality check within the movement, because they were considering dropping it, demilitarization, because it was too hot of a topic. Like it would keeping it in would put everything else on jeopardy. So either play Russian roulette, or give it a try, or drop it and you save the text. And I overheard that conversation. I was way too young back then to say anything about it, but that was surprising to me that that there's some consideration of I don't know. There's this. It reinforced my idea that back then, at least, not anymore right now, that the Pacific was considered a. You had the bigger regions, indigenous regions, but in the Pacific is something that is like, they're also a region, but the more important issues, which was I don't know. That was super disappointing to me back then, and I don't know. I don't know why I'm bringing this up. Well, I do know why I'm bringing this up, but it is a something. And what? Well, yeah, this is why. What I'm personally glad about is that, like climate change, demilitarization, it's the Pacific started bringing it up. We
Yeah.
started bringing it up, and then all of a sudden, like, it started getting some traction. Demilitarization is now also getting traction from Asia and around the other regions. So now it's getting more and more traction, and I think, but that we could have gone a lot further, or like could have been so much stronger if we were if people were not so dismissive of demilitarization 20 years ago. At least, yeah, that's what how I think about it. It is, and yeah, like it's not just basis, but also like, yeah, it's like, well, testing their bombs, or testing their rockets and everything else. That's yeah, even yeah, that is also an important thing, part of demilitarization of our territories.
You know, one of my one of my favorite things about the UN, I think
Mm.
probably the only part of it that makes me feel warm and fuzzy, is that I've had a lot of moments at UN conferences where I am talking to some uncle in slippers in a hotel lobby, singing, talking about bad military trauma, and also just having a good time too. Um, my first UN experience, I was honored to meet Oscar Temaru, who was the former president uh, of French Polynesia,
Hmm.
known as French Polynesia. Um, and it's again this mix of melancholy and bittersweet happiness, but um, seeing such a respected uncle who's been fighting against this and is still alive,
Hmm.
still believes in it. At least at least this fight has given us a moment that all of us with all of this mana have been brought together.
Hmm.
Um, there, because we're gonna be able to figure it out if we all work together. I really, that's so corny, so cheesy, sweet, sugary, but I really believe that it actually
100%.
it again, it's so toxic, and of course there's that stuff that happened during our time, um but it's restorative to be able to be around these people. And I remember every time that I meet other people who have found their way to this and who are finding their way back to um you know what our ancestors have been telling us is the right path. It makes me feel like we're listening and hearing the right things. Um, like we were people that we're supposed to meet.
Mm.
It just always confirms that that I'm reading the signs that I feel that come to me in dreams, that I'm reading them correctly when I meet people who,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even give me words to describe what I've been feeling and didn't know how to describe.
Nice. Yeah, it could it be, yeah, could you qualify it as like ancestral navigation, that there's
Oh. I I want to, but I don't know if I'm that smart.
no, but
Or
by
that
by by saying that our ancestors are guiding us, at least that's what I choose to believe, is that um our ancestors are always, yeah, watching over us, and that they um help us navigate through life, making the right decisions, meeting the right people, or yeah, the right people, like to, yeah, for your, because sometimes you need to meet the wrong people to make
yeah,
the right decision, right? Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to say. um so it's not all just like unicorns and rainbows, obviously, but it is about, yeah, navigation, helping us navigate. Is that, yeah, that's at least this is what I choose to believe.
yeah.
Yeah, it is. Um uh, I'm so that's why I'm having that's why I'm recording, even though I, like, I'm the first one to admit it, I suck at interviewing, but it's why I'm having these conversations, because I want to learn, one, and I want to know how to help, as in, listen to your story, and I'm like, oh yeah, all right, so it gives me um insight into, all right, from a perspective that's not my own, from a, I could easily, well, not easily, but like, if I had to go to a meeting and I would have to say something about decolonization or demilitarization, and people asking me about Guam, like Guam, I sorry, Guåhan, and um, it is now so important to have that, to actually have uh, access, or have that perspective of someone that is within that movement, instead of, yeah, just regurgitating a position paper or whatever. It is, I think it's super important to, yeah, for me at least, if I want to help out with other movements or other indigenous people that I know, that I learn their situation more in depth than just from Wikipedia. um so yeah, and it's,
And of course, like, the reason I started with that, our whole thing with that quote from the Miss Aloha is that we are a vessel for those that came before us, is because this isn't just my story. This is, again, I'm a storyteller. I'm trying my best to, I always, what I say is I try to bring the whole island with me.
mm,
Um, so I know I don't always do a great job of it, but my story is less about me and more about, I want to bring um, I want to bring what our ancestors had back.
mm. It is that something that um we should be, because these stories are super interesting and super important, for each and every one of us, um, especially when you're indigenous, and interesting, and also I think also when if you're not indigenous. um but is there something to say about um creating a, or maybe you're already doing it, I don't know, that, like, a certain method of of journalism or storytelling that that allows for, how should I put it? Like, it is, my mind's all over the place now. Yeah, that is it, like indigenous methods for of storytelling as a basis
Yeah.
for indigenous journalism. I use journalism as a fluid concept, but the ability to record and to tell the stories accurately.
Yeah, I think so, and that is
Phew.
a fight that I am fighting against a a very white industry right now. And there are two of my CHamoru journalist idols
Mhm.
are Tomas Maglonia. They are a broadcast journalist from KUAM, which is a local Guam broadcast station, um, and also a student at Stanford, and Anita Hofschneider, who is with Honolulu Civil Beat, and they are both from the Northern Marianas, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. They are incredible CHamoru journalists who I think do a really good job of grounding things,
Mhm.
and I know are working on Pacific owned and Pacific based journalism. And
Mm.
there are also I don't know if you follow the Instagram plantation convos
I
talking.
do.
Yes, I love that.
Mhm.
And I personally I love writing. I want to become a better writer, and I am always influenced by both archive, myth, and dreams, and oral history. Um, but and this started out actually because I do most of my writing for my grandparents. They're like my favorite people in the whole wide world. They gave me access to this culture that gives me so much happiness.
Mm.
And they fought to be able to give that to me. I do all of my writing and storytelling really for them and with them in mind. But they're both getting older and getting towards that transition and are having trouble uh, reading small text. And so that's one of the reasons that I want to do more interviews. I want to learn how to make videos so that they have another way to engage in this more back and forth storytelling with me.
Mhm.
Because one of the things is, um, I think a lot of people who have known me since I was a kid maybe think that I became Indigenous out of nowhere. But I think that's just because my grandparents didn't trust me with a lot of stories until I showed I was mature enough to handle them. And the more that I participate in the movement, the more of those stories they share with me. And so the most gratifying part of being a storyteller is getting to hear the response.
Mm.
Um, so I want to find more ways to get that response, because I think that's like a really key part of what makes Pacific storytelling special, is that people respond.
Mm.
And I think that's why there are so many like slightly different versions of very similar legends across the Pacific too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's such a um first of all, love your story in like the whole breadth of it, the everything that is everything to do with it, the way that you support yourself, the way that you yeah, articulate how you see things, how you want things. I think that is super admirable. I think that is I think it's a talent. I think it's a talent that I think that your ancestors, including your grandparents, can be super proud of you, 100%. And like it is. I don't know about you, but the fact that you're in DC is like, or similar to the fact that I'm not on my islands right now. I no longer see it as a burden. I see it as an opportunity, as to help out for the movement. And yeah, it is. And I'll definitely say it again. Like, start your own podcast. Do it. Start your own podcast. Well, you don't have to like record your conversations with everyone, but like, yeah, you have such an amazing way of sharing stories. Yeah, that would it would definitely help. A lot of people. I think a lot of people can resonate with your story, and your way of telling stories and your way of talking to people.
I gotta learn how to work all of this stuff first.
It is. I'll show you. No problem. It is. It is super easy and it's free. Well, this is not free though. But like, yeah, yeah. But it is. This is what I'd like to see more. Actually, I like to see more indigenous peoples making use of these platforms, to get their messages out, their thoughts out, and everything else. Because that's also activism. Like you no longer have to be at the mercy of media. You can now create your own media, and you can now distribute it yourself. Like there's so many things that you can do by yourself nowadays. Yes, you have to put a little bit of oomph, a little bit of effort into it, but it is an opportunity to that can be used. Obviously, there's a lot of history and a lot of knowledge that should not be recorded. There's a lot of oral knowledge, knowledge that's transferred orally. I think that everything has to be appropriate, culturally appropriate, obviously. But there are things, stories like these, conversations like these that could help also provide the nuance. And yeah, I don't know. It is. So I'm so super grateful that you asked. Well, yeah, that we can have this conversation on March 1st, March 2nd already for me, but that's okay. On that 500, like, yeah, how do you call it? You cannot call it anniversary, right? It is 500th.
I've just been calling it 500 years since.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel so uncomfortable. Like when that word comes, like it's not just with this situation of Guåhan, but like in other situations as well, like 500th or 70th. Yeah, it's not anniversary. So yeah, it's a year since the arrival of Magellan. Is there any?
Of course, it's really almost symbolic that 500 years later, this pandemic, this global plague is occurring. And also, I'm pretty sure that all of us got COVID at COP25. Like 12 of us from that Indigenous Youth Action all got really sick. But it is 500 years ago, and I got attacked by some Spanish nationalists after I tweeted this, but 500 years ago, so many CHamoru's were killed that the names reflected the loss. There's this one archive called A Tragedy Told in Names, and my favorite of the names, the one that I think is the most beautiful, is this one, Chimitsu, and it means not enough of you. They named children not enough water, not enough food, things like that. Disease really, really killed 96% of the Kanaka Maoli population. The death of the anniversary of the death of Captain Cook did also just occur, February 14th.
February 14th, yeah.
But it's something for us to be able to frame it the way that it is. It's almost appropriate that this is happening with a plague. I mean, during the Spanish flu, the U.S. Navy again used Guam as basically a quarantine station, just as they're doing now. And Guam lost another 6% of its population. So it's sad and weird, and there are so many layers of commemoration happening at this moment. I think there's this Spanish crown's commemoration of what they see as a point of deep national pride. Yet the King of Spain also said that he was, I think it was like extending apologies or recognizing mistakes. He landed in Guam. The U.S. also, in Dave Davis, that guy who is suing Guam for our political status vote, he, if he's any indication, then the American commemoration is one of a good deed done of rescuing the CHamoru's from first the Spanish and then again from the Japanese. And then there's a very different and very complicated CHamoru commemoration. Because in so many history books, this is described as a beginning, and it is the beginning of most history books on Guam. But it's not.
No. If people wanted to learn more about the accurate pre-Magellan history of Guåhan, where should people go?
My favorite, totally free resource. Even my non-CHamoru friends get hooked reading this all night. Okay. Just go to Guampedia, like Wikipedia, but Guampedia.com. That is basically like a Wikipedia for Guam and some wider Pacific history that's written by CHamoru's and by scholars at the University of Guam, by cultural leaders also. And there is terrific, awesome, so cool stuff about like traditional concepts of beauty, all of these different systems of burial, the beautiful lati stones we have that, relate us to the Rapa Nui.
Mm.
There's so much stuff from art to architecture to even just the changes in natural history, things like that. It's a place you could get lost reading. It's my favorite website.
So
I don't even
Guam.
think I've read all of the articles. It's called guampedia.com.
All right, Guampedia.com. I'll definitely add that to the show notes so that people. It's approved by Leilani, so that's.
And there are two incredible organizations on island that I do, well, three that I do really want to highlight.
Yeah.
Independent Guåhan is really leading the sovereignty fight. And of course, they are for independence, but they regularly host events with the other coalitions, those for statehood and free association.
Mm-hmm.
All three coalitions would just like the basic right to a vote. Independent Guåhan also does lots and lots of open podcasts with Chamoru history, Chamoru culture. Sometimes they also work with Putehi Litekzun, Save Ritidian. Litekzun, also known as Ritidian, is one of the live fire training sites that we discussed, the north part of the island. It includes bombing of a cave that includes cave paintings of traditional Chamoru star calendars, among other things. Our sis Muñeca works with the Micronesia Climate Change Alliance, and we are fighting for a more sustainable Guam, a more sustainable Pacific, really, and a reunited Marianas. And Guåhan is going through a really hard time right now. The US is not doing much on the continent or in the territories in the way of COVID. A lot of hotels are being used as quarantine stations. I think more than a third of Guåhan is renters, but there is a indigenous Chamoru led and Chamoru value led mutual aid group called Para Todos HIT, PARATODUSHIT. And they've been providing diapers, basic necessities for families on island, and are led by the value of Inafamalek, of to make right together.
Right. It's just I'm definitely want to learn more about Guåhan, so I'm going to text Monica in a bit, ask her to be on a podcast as well, and also about militarization. I want to learn more in Guåhan, obviously, and yeah, oh man, there's so many things that I like. This is what I like. I just learn in public. I don't care anymore. I just invite people and just ask them.
People should see people learning. Like it's a good thing, and it's a complicated thing, and it's really freeing to be able to say that you don't know something, because then you get to learn something.
I don't know. I really don't know. I say, like, you tell me a lot, and I get the feeling that I know more of what I don't know, actually, and which is
that's what learning is.
That's what learning is, yeah. And it's feeling like going back to law school all over again, which was already one big blur. But yeah, this is I feel that this is like, yeah, it's funny. Like I just schedule one conversation. I'm like, you know what? Yeah, next one should be with this one because I learned from this person. You know, like it's a process. So I just this is my way of warning you that I could invite you back to the podcast probably on several occasions actually. I don't know, but like
to talk about too.
There's a lot more that we can talk about.
But also, you gotta have Muñeca on. This just presented at the Marianas History Conference. An incredible presentation called I think it was What If Magellan Did Balutan, which is to make plate, all about single-use plastics and colonization in the Pacific. It was awesome.
Oh, like I love it already because
Yeah,
I love it already because I don't know anything about it. Single-use, like I know like about single-use plastic, of course, but like like there's a whole movement on it. So yeah, that's I love it already. So yeah, Leilani, thank you so much for your time. It's been 3 hours already. That we've been talking. Thank you so much for. Sorry.
Namasi. Thank you. It's been fun.
It's been it was so much fun listening to you, and appreciate you for again for taking the time, everything that you do, and this is always the hardest part, saying goodbye. Oh no, yeah. Hopefully that we someday we can do this in person, and yeah, and by the way, I'm gonna I'll have a conversation with Nate soon as well, so this is gonna be fun. Pardon me?
He's a smarty.
I know, yeah, and also like he's gonna educate me on Dungeons and Dragons. So yeah, so like I'm just gonna pick his brain on like oceans and waters and everything else, and also on gaming and Dungeons and Dragons. I'm already looking forward to it. Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you so much, Leilani. It's evening. I know you probably want to get some food or something. Have a nice evening. Stay healthy. Stay safe. And if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know.
Yeah, missing you. I can't wait to see you in person again.
100%. Yeah, and we'll have some fun as well. Laughs and stories there, sharing and everything else. Yeah. All right. Have a great day.
This is the Gomaluku Podcast.